Where are you?
I'm in Boston. I'm in Boston.
I mean,
right now I happen to be in New York, but I generally am in Boston. That's where I live and where I do my thing. Let me just. All right, just waiting for my YouTube to do its thing here. And I want to be sure that we're live and functioning. Let's see. All right, welcome to the program. Charles Martin joining me, everyone, Monday through Friday, 12 noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And my guest is Bob Ingram. He is, he's got quite a biography here. Let me just see. I was calling you up. I was going to, he's a former editor of Executive Intelligence Review magazine. He's the author of several books, most notably The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire, which examines the history and the nature of the global financial imperial system. You've written on American history, including pieces on Benjamin Franklin, Alexander Hamilton, and Ulysses S. Grant. Bob, thanks for joining me today.
Well, I'm very happy to be here.
So, Bob, I want to just go right to a kind of a nutshell examination of the philosophy and political approach of the LaRouche group that you've worked with for many, many years. My understanding is that they tend to advocate national sovereignty and a government representing the people of that sovereign nation operating in a way that is in the interests of that nation, as opposed to being controlled by the sort of informal international oligarchy that that we now, I would argue, are struggling with. What say you with regard to the overall philosophy there?
Well, what you said was absolutely accurate as to what the LaRouche movement has been fighting for quite a long time. In our Constitution, the government is given the responsibility, as a mandatory responsibility, to protect and defend the general welfare of the people. And I think it's fairly obvious to all of our listeners that in recent decades, that mandate has not been obeyed by our government leaders. I would make a point, though, that there is a deeper philosophical issue, which is something that most people often don't think about or rarely think about. Which is that what Lyndon LaRouche wrote about over many decades was the distinction between the human species and all other living species on our planet. The human species, human beings, are made in the image of God and are governed by the capacity for reason, and that what exists in the minds, in the souls of each and every human individual is the potential for creative discoveries. And what you had with the American Revolution, with the creation of the American Republic, was for the first time in human history, a government formed on that basis. Not that they wrote into our documents deep philosophical discussions, but that they recognized that up until 1776, human society had by and large been ruled by oligarchical systems where the few ruled the many, where the human species was kept backwards, generally illiterate, generally treated like beasts of burden. That was true in ancient times, that was true in medieval times, and it was true up until the American Revolution. And the American Revolution said no, that each and every citizen of the Republic is a valuable resource, and each person has the potential to contribute something creatively to the future, to future generations. So we're going to form a nation based on that principle. And if you look at the economic writings of Alexander Hamilton, who was widely misunderstood, but if you look at his economic writings, there are two principles there which are very, very clear. One is that the government will, and Hamilton discusses this in his report on manufacturers, that the government will foster policies which will lead to a increase in scientific and technological progress. And secondly, that the government will have sovereignty over its own banking and monetary affairs. That the economic and monetary and banking policies of the country will not be dictated by a private elite, but that the government will have sovereign control over its own banking and monetary and financial system, such that that system will be utilized in a way that this will contribute to human progress. I'll just, not to keep talking, but I'll just say this was a central issue for Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. The question of human advancement, human progress. You cannot separate this. You cannot just talk about freedom and liberty in a general sense. We're free to do this, we're free to do that. What Hamilton understood, what Lincoln understood, is that the fundamental freedom of the American Republic is the freedom to progress, the freedom to advance, and this can and that it is the sovereign responsibility of our government, of our nation, to ensure that that freedom to advance actually occurs. It's not impeded. It's not misdirected or prevented by private financial interest, a private financial oligarchy, which is what we see today. So that's what I would say.
Okay, I mean, it's very well stated, and I think you're describing the overall American philosophy and politics of government, and in a sense, it's consistent with the best elements of human nature. As you say, we were created by God, and we are in the image of God. We're not perfect because we're not gods, but at the same time, every generation has striven, in that sense, to know who we are through reason. We have the ability to engage in reason. Adam was able to name all the animals in the universe and plants and things because he used language, he used communication. That was the development of reason. That was the development of the human soul. That's what separated us from all other living beings. And that the American government, it took that long to distill these ideas in the form of a government that would, as Jefferson put in the Declaration of Independence, be endowed by the Creator, not by the state, which is to say that we answer ultimately to the great sovereign God, and that we are sovereign, and that we give a limited grant of power to a state to preserve, protect, and defend, and I would say advance our own interests. It's the idea of the sovereign nation state within a context of laws and a context of limited government that I think was advanced there, and it did us from this idea of an oligarchy ruling through fiat and giving rights as favors, as opposed to rights as being inherent, with us giving the government limited powers to protect those rights. Now, you talk about the certain founding fathers, particularly Franklin and Hamilton, and others, I think Madison to a certain degree, as having a nationalist vision for the Confederation of American States, in that they wanted to see an America operating in its interest by developing technology, by developing science, in areas of intellectual growth and cultural growth, And you also talk about the importance of controlling finance through a national bank. Now, this is where things get a little controversial because, first of all, it is true that the Constitution actually says, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, that Congress shall coin money and regulate the value thereof, which means that the Congress, the U.S. Congress, our hall of the people who we elect people to represent us, they ultimately control the money. They decide the value of the money by deciding how much or how little is spent into the economy, and which is how inflation or deflation is determined. And yet there seems to be somewhat of a contradiction between that idea and the idea of a private central bank deciding on these things. Now, I think there's a difference between the original chartered bank by Hamilton and the second bank, which was chartered after the War of 1812, and the Federal Reserve today, which seems to me to be a more representative of not the national interest, but the Wall Street internationalists, the globalists, the speculators, people who aren't creating production, and people who are not loyal to the nation state. So talk a little bit about the idea of the national bank as it was originally suggested by Hamilton.
Yeah, well, let me put it this way: that you had different attempts at this, as you said. Hamilton created the first national bank in 1790. Or thereabouts, and this then was shut down by Madison, actually. And
well, it expired. It had a 20-year charter.
Yeah. They created a second national bank, which existed for 20 years, which was shut down by Andrew Jackson. Then Abraham Lincoln created in two banking acts that were passed during the Civil War. He created a national banking system, which was different from a national bank, but in combination with the Greenbacks, which were issued by the Lincoln administration, by the Treasury Department, it functioned in a similar way. Now, the Federal Reserve is something entirely different. The Federal Reserve is really modeled on the European central banking idea. And a lot of people today say that Hamilton's national bank was a central bank like modern central banks. And these are much different things. Look, the question is, what Hamilton wrote about was the, and this is something that Lyndon LaRouche talked about for many, frequently over many years, is the question of a credit system versus a money system. And people have a problem really understanding that, because they think of credit in terms of credit cards and debt and things of this sort. But what you're talking about is two different things. A money system, which is what we see today with the International Monetary Fund, with the central banks, the European Central Bank, all of this stuff, or what you see with all of the hedge funds and the offshore banking systems. This is a system which is set up and designed to do one thing and one thing only, which is to make money. And of course, a lot of people say, well, I would like to make money, but it's not designed to help small fry, to help the individual citizen. It's designed to enrich, the upper 1%, or upper 1/10 of 1%. It's a money system controlled by a financial oligarchy, which is philosophically grounded in the idea of human greed. And this
if I could just interject, I think it's a money system that is, it's not based upon actual production. It's not. It's speculation. It's basically shifting around currencies, and that it benefits. It gets very ethereal. It benefits the very top 1% versus the Hamilton model and the Biddle model, which
Right.
was a bank that was majority owned by the government, by the state, that would basically then invest in various industries like the Erie Canal or other projects, create money by means of that investment. Those investments would be very conservative. The interest would be very low. And the money from that interest would primarily go back into the US government, which then would be reinvested into other projects. I mean, the whole model was actually started in my own home state of Massachusetts during colonial times, when they developed a land bank that was run by the colonial government and that issued currency, what they called scrip, and that based the issuance of that currency on small manufacturers and farmers who would then go to the bank, get a loan to conduct their business, and that the interest, which was very low, would go to things like public works, building. I mean, at that time, the governor built a system of lights in the city of Boston from that money, and that it really created a strong state in Massachusetts. And then other states started emulating it, using tobacco as collateral in Maryland. In fact, if you go to the Maryland State House today, on the grounds of that state house, there's the tobacco house, where people would trade tobacco as collateral. They would create currency based upon projection that were conservative, and the interest rate would go toward financing the state. By this means, taxes were low, and the money was worth a lot because it was based upon conservative estimates of production. That is gone with the Federal Reserve System and with the internationalists, who are simply involving the creation of money based on fiat and are simply responding to a government that wants money created for things other than production. They want to pay for pet projects, or they want to send the money to international dictators, or they want to give the money to their political friends. So, there needs to be a system in place where the national purse, the national bank, is controlled by the Congress to a large degree, because Congress ultimately decides, but it also benefits the American people. It's out in the open. It's not controlled by these private oligarchs and these private merchant houses, which have no loyalty to anything other than their own pocket.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, look, there's two parts to answer what you just said. I mean, one is that you get some people who get a little, are just off, and that they say, well, the National Bank was a private bank, or what Lincoln did with his national banking system. These were private banks, and that's just like the Federal Reserve. It's private banks. What you want is a national bank controlled by the government. Well, no, you really don't. I mean, if you have a national bank which is wholly owned by the government, a national banking system in which every bank is owned by the government, well, then you got socialism. That's not what you want. Mm-hmm. You want a banking system which is privately owned. The question is, in terms of national policy, who's in charge? That's the issue. Our current Federal Reserve System is owned and operated by and in the interest of Wells Fargo, Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase. If you look at what Lincoln did with his private banking system, they set up a national private banking system. And these were, and this was made up entirely of hundreds of private banks all over the United States. But to join that banking system, those banks had to deposit a third of their capital with the U.S. Treasury. They received greenbacks in return. The national banking policy was set by the U.S. Treasury. The U.S. Treasury had the right to examine the books of all of these banks, to have bank regulators for all of these banks, and the issuance of currency and greenbacks was entirely controlled by the U.S. Treasury. So what you were creating, and this really is a credit system, what you were creating was a flow of greenbacks, a flow of federal credit into the private banks to then be deployed by those banks into productive investment, into building things. That's how they built the Transcontinental Railroad. That's how they built thousands of miles of railroads. That's how they built a modern steel industry, modern manufacturing. That's how they brought new technologies online. And this was done in conjunction with other federal policy. Lincoln established the National Academy of Sciences, where they brought together the leading scientists in the country. And, they established, what Lyndon LaRouche would call a science driver policy, where you were investing and pursuing the most advanced frontier areas of science, where you were creating the basis for new inventions, new discoveries, new technologies, all of which were advancing the productive economy of the country as a conscious, deliberate policy. Mm-hmm. And that's the orientation. That's what you want to do. And at the same time, you're controlling speculation. Under Lincoln, they outlawed options trading. And that ban on options trading was repealed after Lincoln was assassinated in the 1870s. They repealed that. Mm-hmm. And it was put back in place by Franklin Roosevelt and in the 1930s. Mm-hmm. Roosevelt banned options trading, and he controlled futures trading. He made it, he constrained it to a very limited limited degree of what was allowed. Under Roosevelt, they put through the Glass-Steagall Act, which outlawed banks being involved in financial speculation.
Right. So, it separated the bank from like Wall Street investment houses. Yeah, and also what you're describing in a way is that the national banks that was set up by Lincoln, and there was several of them. There was one in Boston, I know that, and they were in all the major cities in the country, that they had to be very conservative in terms of what they would invest in, because they had to have a return on the investment. It wasn't like they were just wildly spending money, and that it restrained Congress from getting involved in these huge, wild pork barrel spending projects. Instead, it would have to be conservatively funneled through the Treasury Department and these national banks. And then you also had the growth of private banks, which were not part of the national system, that were based upon 100% assets. They didn't do fractional reserve. It sort of operated like credit unions operate today. They had to have, so they also had to be careful about lending money out, because if they lost money, then they would be in trouble. And it wasn't like they just could create money out of nothing. And so you had a pretty conservative system that was involved in investing in things that were going to have a return, and that were, and there was a sort of a nationalist orientation in that cities, states, and the nation would go to the bank with projects and get the money they needed, because those projects were well presented and they were good and solid.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. What you want, Lyndon LaRouche once wrote a paper. I forget what year it was. Mm-hmm. It was decades ago. He wrote a paper entitled something like, this is not the exact title, how to expand credit without causing inflation. Mm-hmm. And you want, that's not the exact title, but that's close. And the idea is, if you understand the principle of sovereign public credit, as Hamilton understood it, you actually want to create a massive flow of credit into the economy. and that can be done, and it can be done in a way that's completely non-inflationary. I mean, if you're doing what the government does now, which is just print trillions of
turning
dollars
on the printing press and
turn
paying
on the
interest
printing
on
press.
it. No, it was based upon estimates of future production. It's like,
Yeah,
you know, I
exactly.
mean, that's like when you buy a house, you take a look at your past, you take a look at your present financial condition, and then you make a projection that you can do this, you can afford it, and so the bank basically creates money to buy the property for you in your name, and then they own the deed on it and the lien on it until it's paid off. But the thing is, it's done in a way that makes a sound projection, and the government used to invest in things that had a sound future, like the transcontinental railway system, which created whole cities and whole areas of industry and all these side projects, and the great canals and the airports and other various projects that employed tens and hundreds of thousands of people, which then created more income in order to keep up with that employment creation. And then the money would be created as a reflection of the production needed in an economy. It wasn't just printed out of thin air, and thus it actually had value, because money is an abstract concept. It has to be given value based upon the nature of the nation that authorized its creation.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. And the key is really to recognize and this is not something that you can write down a detailed plan and stick it in the Constitution. It's really an idea, a concept. The idea is to recognize the importance of pursuing a credit policy which fosters scientific and technological progress. If you're increasing the productivity of your overall economy, and if you're increasing the productive power of your individual citizen, your individual member of the workforce, where that individual worker their output is increasing through advances in science and technology, then that is generating a form of wealth, productive wealth, which is the basis then for the soundness of your economic system, the soundness of your money, and it, is making your economy strong. That's what needs to be done. I mean, this is where revolutions in technology, like with the railroad system, when it first came in, Thomas Edison and what followed Thomas Edison with the electrification of the economy, things that Roosevelt did with the Tennessee Valley Authority, what we got out of NASA and the Apollo space program, the advances in nuclear energy, the potential of fusion energy. You're creating. This is not just incremental progress. You're creating revolutions. Revolutions. I mean, this is something that we talked about. If you look at the history of the human species, where we went from burning wood to burning coal to burning oil to nuclear power, you're making leaps in technological progress, which have a nonlinear effect on the productive power of the population. And that's what your credit system, your banking system, and your sovereign government, if it's thinking correctly, that's what you're trying to foster. Not, short-term get-rich-quick money schemes, but you're trying to foster that kind of progress. Mm-hmm. That's what leads to human happiness. If you go back to the Declaration of Independence, where it says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, it's not life, liberty, and the pursuit of pleasure. You're not looking for short-term pleasure. You're looking for something, you're looking for a policy direction, an intention, which is going to foster human happiness. Well, human happiness, is something where you're trying to create a society in which your children and your grandchildren have a better life than you have. And that is only possible if the government is thinking 20, 40, 50 years into the future of creating a society which is more productive, in which you're making new discoveries. I mean, if you think back to this question of what distinguishes human beings from animals, animals are based on pleasure. They're based on looking for food, looking for this, looking for that. Whereas human beings have the ability to be creative, to make discoveries, whether it's in science, whether it's in music, whether it's in some other field. And this is the joy of being human. And you look at a child who makes a discovery, and there's joy in that. The joy of being a human being, in the ability to be creative. And that not only is what makes us human, the ability to make new discoveries is what creates a productive economy.
Yeah, and the ability to invent, the ability to imagine, the ability of a musician to write a symphony. I mean, these are abstract values. Anything that, all of these things enhance our life, and they enhance our ability to understand ourselves and do introspection, and as such, then create and advance our civilization. Now, you talk about Lincoln's greenbacks. My understanding is that Lincoln was approached by the international banking houses early in the Civil War, as was the southern states, and said, we're going to lend you the money at this exorbitant interest rate so that you can, conduct this war. And he said, no, he said, I'm not going to do this. I can create the money right out of the U.S. Treasury. All I have to, there's no reason for me to have money that I borrow. I'm the president of the United States. We can create the money as a national interest. And so he basically went to the Treasury and said, print me the money. And that's what the greenbacks were. And he used them successfully to conclude the Civil War and reunite the nation and stop the most significant conspiracy against America in history. Afterwards, he was heavily criticized, or the policy was criticized by successive governments, as they had to go back to the hard gold standard, and there was a contraction in economy as a result. So, talk a little bit about the actual greenback policy, and then in the aftermath, the gold standard versus the silver argument, and that issue.
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, what happened in 1861 was that it wasn't that the British made these exorbitant demands. The British actually cut the United States off right after the Lincoln administration. Mm-hmm. They suspended specie payment, which is gold payment to the U.S. government, and the British cut us off. And this was, a very ruthless and very deliberate action to prevent Lincoln from being able to oppose the Southern secession.
Right.
The British were backing Southern secession, and they wanted to divide and destroy the American Republic. At that point, Lincoln's Treasury Secretary, Chase, went to the New York banks. Now, the problem with the New York banks is that they really were allied with the British, and the New York banks, together with some banks in Boston, these were what were called the Associated Banks of New York and Boston. They said, "Well, we'll lend you the money, but here's our conditions." And their conditions were that the U.S. government hand over all of the gold in the U.S. Mint, U.S. Treasury, and deposit that gold in the New York banks, that the government would agree to finance the war and finance war loans by massive increases in taxation. And they had other measures as well, which they demanded, which essentially amounted to that the U.S. government hand over all control of money, gold, and taxation policy to the banks in New York and Boston, surrender its national sovereignty. And the Treasury Secretary, Chase, was ready to do that. And Lincoln said no. Lincoln said, I'm not going to do that. And there was actually a meeting in Washington, D.C. between Lincoln and these bankers. And Lincoln said, I'm not going to accept your demands, because this was really an ultimatum. Mm-hmm. And Lincoln said, I'm not going to accept your demands. And he threw these guys out. And he came up with his own policy, which was a combination of four things. Number one, that he was going to establish his own national banking system, that he was going to issue hundreds of millions of dollars of greenbacks, which was a revolutionary act because we had never had a national paper currency under the U.S. Constitution. And third, he was going to issue U.S. bonds, but these bonds would not be sold to the bankers. They would be sold to the U.S. citizens at low interest, essentially war bonds, more or less. And fourth, he was going to institute a protective tariff to protect U.S. manufacturing, so we would get investment into manufacturing. And this was a nationalist, sovereign economic program which he put forward. And during the war, they created a national banking system. These banks were tightly regulated by the U.S. Treasury, privately owned, but tightly regulated. They issued over $400 million in greenbacks, which were then issued largely, not entirely, but largely issued through this banking system. So the banking system became a nationally regulated credit system. They had the protective tariffs, and you know what you got between 1861 and 1865 was the greatest expansion of industry and manufacturing of any nation in human history. It was astounding. Mm-hmm. It was a revolution in industrial production. After Lincoln died, the bankers moved in, the British moved in to destroy the system that Lincoln had created. And they demanded that the greenbacks be withdrawn. They demanded that the United States go back, as you said, go back on the British gold standard. You know, that the credit system that Lincoln had created be wiped out and that sort of thing. And there was a huge fight around this between 1865 and 1876. Ultimately, through enormous pressure, the greenbacks were withdrawn by 1879, and we went back on the British gold standard. Now, certain things were kept, the high tariffs were kept, and certain other things were done. So, you know, there were some good policies. It wasn't all bad. There were some good policies that continued through the 1880s and 1890s. But because of the withdrawal of the greenbacks, and because we went back on the British gold system, you know, this had a very bad effect. And there was a shortage of credit, a shortage of money. And in particular, in the West and in the South, this had a terrible effect. And what this did was it undermined, you know, the political coalition that Lincoln had created. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Republican Party, as Lincoln created it between 1856 and 1860, was really a working man's party. It was committed to the general welfare. It was committed to uplifting all of the American people. But gradually, step by step in the 1880s and 1890s, the Republican Party began to represent more and more the interest, the moneyed interest, and not entirely, but this really did occur.
Mm-hmm.
So people felt betrayed, and they began to go into populist movements and all this. It's not worth going into all the details. You mentioned the silver movement.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the silver movement was one of these things. There was a real shortage of money.
Right.
And so
silver was easy money. It was easy coinage.
So what happened was that people came up with the idea. Well, we're on this gold system, this species system, and we need more money. So why don't we monetize silver as well? We'll have sort of a bimetallic system, and if we monetize silver, this will enable us to put more money into circulation. And you got this William Jennings Bryan was for this.
Sure. And
you got this thing called the Sherman Silver Act. I think they actually passed two, I'm not sure, but I think they passed two silver acts, which allowed for the limited coining of silver money. And that helped out a little bit, but it didn't change the fact that we were still on this hard metallic system. And so it helped, but it wasn't.
Understood. We were still pegged to the barbarous species of gold,
right?
Which, by the way, is a commodity. It's not real. I mean, it's been recognized internationally as money going all the way back to ancient times, and it can serve as a vehicle to stabilize economies, and it's a means of international exchange between nations, but it doesn't necessarily, and in fact, it doesn't have to be used to back a currency. And in 1970, it was actually Richard Nixon who took the United States completely off the gold standard. And
well, see, he took us off the gold reserve system. See, what Roosevelt did is Roosevelt eliminated the gold standard entirely. And later in the negotiations in 1945 around the creation of the Bretton Woods system, what the U.S. delegation at Bretton Woods under Roosevelt's direction, what they created what was called the gold reserve system. And this eliminated the restrictions of a strict gold standard, which was a good thing to eliminate those, because that Lincoln had done that. But see, what Lincoln did only applied to the United States. I mean, what Lincoln did was sort of a declaration of independence, saying the United States is not going to be under this gold standard.
Right.
But what Roosevelt did applied worldwide. He got every nation at Bretton Woods to agree to a system where there would be no gold standard, but where you would have a gold reserve system in which you would peg the value of the currencies to gold. And what that meant, and the importance of that was to eliminate currency speculation, so that all of the currencies would have a stable value. So that if you bought something with one currency and sold it in another currency, you would know what it was worth. You would know what it was worth, that you would have a stable system of currency values. But this did not affect the right of countries, the right of nation states, sovereign nations, to issue their own paper currency, to have their own internal credit system where they could issue credit for investment in manufacturing or anything else. Mm-hmm. So, this was what was done. Now, what Nixon did in 1971 was saying, no, we're going to eliminate the gold reserve system, and we're going to have floating exchange rates, and this basically said, that this allowed a massive explosion of speculation, where you could.
So that was, in a way, a gift to the international oligarchy.
Exactly.
And I think it was Federal Reserve Chairman at the time, the name escapes me, who was the mastermind behind that. I think Paul Volcker, I
Yeah.
believe. And so since then, you had international currency speculators, like people like, for example, I don't want to mention the name because I could get banned here at YouTube. It rhymes with the Yiddish word called Soros. Okay, who suddenly started making fortunes by shorting currencies in different countries, and now these people are involved with international intrigue, like creating bioweapons that could be released on the entire world. I mean, this is part of this kind of internationalist, amoral world order oligarchy that is trying to transcend the sovereign nation state. I want to be careful here because YouTube, we could be banned.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah, no, look, the fundamental, there's two issues. I mean, one is this question of human advancement. That's what our government, that's the commitment to the general welfare. The general welfare for our population and for our posterity, for future generations. Mm-hmm. Human advancement. The government has a mandate, has a moral responsibility to ensure that the advancement of the population is protected and is promoted and fostered for advancement for future generations. But the key to this, and this gets to what's happened since we went off the Bretton Woods system in 1971, the key to this is national sovereignty. You know, that the government that see, a lot of people say, I'm against big government, I'm against big government. Well, our government has done horrible things, and it's doing terrible things right now under Biden. But, rather than think about the government, think about, instead, think about the question of the republic, because that's what was established in 1776 for the first time in human history. A sovereign republic committed to defending the general welfare. And that republic must be sovereign. You don't allow, Silicon Valley technocrats to set policy. You don't allow the World Economic Forum at Davos to set policy. You don't allow central bankers, international bankers to set policy. The government must defend the general welfare. The republic must defend the general welfare. This is all based on absolute national sovereignty. And this is one of the things that happened under Trump, where Trump would take actions, like when he pulled us out of the, World Trade Organization. He pulled us out of the Paris Climate Accords. He said, we're not going to allow supranational institutions to dictate policy to the United States. Well, he was right about that. But you've got to go further and say, we're not going to allow globalist banking institutions, financial institutions, to control our economic policy. Sovereignty is absolutely fundamental to understanding what needs to be done today. So I would just say that.
No, it's incredible. Yeah, I mean, we set up a government with elected representatives and with an executive and with a separate judiciary and with a balance of power, all to basically operate in the interest of and in the express will of the American people to advance our interest. Now, Robert, how do you think the Federal Reserve today could be seen, and what sort of a role should it be playing in our nation today?
Well, I'm not going to give you a piece of legislation. The Federal Reserve that exists today has to be gotten rid of. Now, whether you, and it obviously has to be done in an orderly fashion. You can't just have chaos. Right. But whether you abolish the Federal Reserve and replace it with a national bank, or whether you simply transform the Federal Reserve through certain periods of through certain types of legislation, I'm not going to debate the fine points of it. But the Federal Reserve System, first of all, the independence of the Federal Reserve, whether you change it or whether you replace it, the independence of the Federal Reserve has to be gotten rid of. The Federal Reserve has to be placed entirely under the control of the U.S. Treasury. The Treasury has to take back power over the issuance of money. We have to. It is absolutely critical that we shut down the spigot on financial speculation. You know, there have been efforts over the last 10 to 15 years to bring back the Glass-Steagall legislation. This is absolutely key. You know, as you mentioned, there may be people listening to this who don't really know what Glass-Steagall is, but Glass-Steagall was legislation that was passed by Congress in the 1930s, signed into law by Franklin Roosevelt. What it did was it created a wall between the banks and financial speculation. It, you know, that people who wanted to engage in financial speculation could do that, although there were certain laws passed which banned various kinds of financial speculation, but banks were prohibited from it. That banks, which were part of the Federal Reserve System, could not engage in any form of financial speculation. They were strictly limited to what was known, you know, what you would think of as traditional commercial banking. They could invest in building houses. They could invest in loaning to farmers. They could invest in loaning to small businesses. They could invest in loaning to manufacturing or industry or into research and development, but they could not speculate. And obviously that has to be reinstituted. Mm-hmm. You bring back Glass-Steagall, you bring the Federal Reserve under the control of the U.S. Treasury, you create a flow of credit going through the commercial banking system into manufacturing, home building, small businesses, farms. So you begin to recreate a credit system, a national credit system in which the credit is being used in a useful way. And people say, well, who determines what a useful way? Well, the Treasury determines it. You know, the Congress determines it. And if you don't like what they're doing, then you elect new different representatives.
Well, if I could I want to just push back a little bit on that, in that I think there's a value to having a somewhat of an independent money system that is not under the direct control of the government, because if the government directly controls it, they could then just go in and start printing up money and expanding their powers. In a way, there has to be some means by which, a Federal Reserve type system could exist, except more in balance with the government. And yet at the same time, you can't have a president or a Congress show up and say, give me money.
Well, it wouldn't work in that way. I mean, if you look at the system Lincoln created, they created a national banking system. And, as I said, by the end of the Civil War, I think there were hundreds of banks that were part of this system. I don't have the precise number, but it was it was at the end of the Civil War, it was over 90% of the banks in the country. There were still some independent, privately owned banks, but 90% of the banks in the country belonged to this national banking system. The government didn't go in. It had no power under the legislation which created the national banking system. The government had no power to go in and say to these banks, this is who you're going to lend money to, and this is who you're not going to lend money to. It was a privately run system. But the idea was that it was regulated in such a way. There were very strict reserve requirements for these banks. They could not just go off willy-nilly and speculate and do wild things. In a certain sense, it was what you said earlier. It was conservative. It was carefully regulated as to make it financially sound. But at the same time, the government was supplying credit through the issuance of greenbacks into these banks, where these banks then had a sufficient capital to begin to loan money out into various enterprises and what have you. You also had government projects where things like the Transcontinental Railroad were being built, or things of that type. And it is like we saw later with the space program with John Kennedy, where you had big government contracts to build things, but then, people think, well, the government spent all this money. Well, it doesn't really work in that way. Like with the Transcontinental Railroad, the government had projects, the government helped finance and loan money to build the Transcontinental Railroad. But then to build the Transcontinental Railroad, you need to have hundreds, thousands of subcontractors.
Of course. It creates a whole massive increase in production.
It creates a chain reaction.
Oh, yeah. So, Robert, we're kind of reaching the end of the hour.
Let me just finish my thought.
Yeah, please.
So what you have is a national banking system where people are going to it saying, I have a contract to build rails, to build steel for this Transcontinental Railroad. I have a contract to saw wood to build the railroad ties. I have a contract, to build, to manufacture the nails. I have, so people are going to this national banking system, and the national banking system then has the capital through the greenback policy to make loans to build these things.
Right.
And what you're creating is this productive credit system.
You're creating wealth. Robert, let my listeners and viewers know where they can read your books and get information about your work.
Well, I've written 3 books. One is called The Modern Anglo-Dutch Empire. And to tell you the truth, right offhand, the other 3 titles of the book sort of escape me at the moment. Okay. One is a book on American history, which goes into, in depth, Alexander Hamilton and other aspects of American history. Ulysses Grant. It's called A New Birth of Freedom, A New Birth of Freedom. And then there is a 3rd book, which goes into Benjamin Franklin and other things. There's actually articles in it on Machiavelli and on Dante. All of these books are available on Amazon, both in EPUB or in digital format and in printed format. My name is Robert Ingraham, Ingraham, and you can get these books on Amazon. Also, I've, the 3rd book is entitled Hidden in Plain Sight. Also, if you go to the LaRouche PAC website, I've done a series of classes and podcasts in video. One is a series of classes on the modern Anglo-Dutch Empire, and I'm right now in the process of doing a in-depth series of podcasts on Abraham Lincoln, on the greenback policy, on many aspects of Lincoln's life and his political career. So those are all available for people who wish to pursue it further.
No, listen, I really want to thank you very much. Lincoln was a greater man than we even knew he was, which everyone knows he was a great man. Yes, and I'd like to follow up with you from time to time and do some programming. It's what you're doing is very interesting and very important.
Well, I really appreciate it, Charles. I really do. I'm very happy you invited me here.
Thank you very much, sir, and I will talk to you soon.
Okay.
Thanks a lot. Have a great day. God bless.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Hi.
Oh, good. You'll replace
I'm going down. Okay.
Yeah, that's good. And then it's always says she wants to leave soon. She shouldn't leave.
No, it's all right.